Scott Hansen here from NFL Red Zone. I hope you're checking out 1 hour of 5-Yard Rush, one of the best podcasts on NFL football in the UK.
What's happening, Rush Nation? How are we doing? It's good to be back in the chair. It's been a little while. It's been a hot minute, but that's fine. We're going to do 2 podcasts this week, get this one out, and then we'll start reviewing the rookies to get you ready for what is coming in terms of the NFL draft and preparing for best ball season, dynasty season, rookie drafts, and all that good stuff. Today, I'm going to review free agency for you. I'm going to go through every team, outline the key bits for fantasy, and so they give you a view of where I think they're looking at in the draft and areas of need and areas they might still attack. So this will start to paint some clarity as we talk about it later on in the week as well. So let's dive straight into this because I want to do this in 45 minutes, 48 minutes if we're going that. I'm going to do this division by division. I'm going to start with the AFC. I'm going to kick off with the AFC East. And that means we're going to kick off with the Buffalo Bills. Probably the biggest pieces they did was they got Josh Allen signed. He's got a 6-year deal, $250 million guaranteed. One of the highest paid players in the league now, which is they got their man under center for the foreseeable future. Running back didn't really attack that too much. They signed Darrington Evans to a pretty small deal, really, in terms of money. So not really anything they're going to do, but they did re-up Ty Johnson. So we've got a clear hierarchy of Cook, Johnson, Evans there. Don't think that's an area they're going to sort of go a high pick on in the draft. And then they've got wide receivers, and I still think this is an area they'll go for in the draft. I don't think they got what they needed out of Keon Coleman. That could change. They have added Josh Palmer into the situation where he got 18 million guaranteed, 36 million contract. It effectively becomes like a 2-year deal on Josh Palmer to see what he offers, and that could be really interesting. And they re-upped Khalil Shakir, and they paid him a lot of money, 32 million guaranteed over 4 years. It's a really sort of sizable deal. I would be surprised if they went with Coleman, Palmer, Shakir only. I do think that they could attack that position in the draft. But for the rest of fantasy football, they've got the tight end sorted in Kincaid. They've got the running back room sorted. We're not going to see too much movement from a fantasy side of what this team can do. They have invested a little bit in the offensive line. I think I'd like to see them do a little bit more in the draft just to give them a bit of extra protection. It's a pretty good O-line, though, having said that. So I think really in terms of the Bills, there isn't too much that's going to change. It's whether or not they land a marquee wide receiver. And to be honest, I don't think there is that in this draft for them. I think they could get another piece and develop, but unless they find a guy that they love in the later rounds, I don't think this year there's going to be too much difference from what we saw last year, other than obviously we've got Josh Palmer coming in. So for the draft going forward, I don't think we're going to see too much. The Dolphins, they have obviously lost Raheem Mostert and brought in Alexander Mattison. I think he sits as the 2 behind Achane, so that makes complete sense. They brought in Zach Wilson to be the understudy to Tua, which again makes sense. None of this really is overly important fancy. I guess Mattison could have a bit of a role. He could be one of those players that could be really worth a late round flyer. Achane has injuries; he could be worth a pickup, but not someone you're investing too heavily in. And then they brought in 2 wide receivers, Eskridge, who actually was with the Dolphins last year, a bit of a special teams kind of pick, and then Nick Westbrook-Akeen comes in on a really cheap deal, 3.2 million guaranteed, 2-year deal, 6.5 total. So not a big deal. I imagine he's going to be a stretch to play guy to be out there as a threat to kind of get Tyreek Hill open. I don't think he's someone in fantasy who's going to be relevant. So again, this team is a narrow team. There's not too much that changes. What was really important is this team needed to invest in O-line, and it really has done. It's re-signed a couple of players in Carmen and Eichenberg, but it has brought in Larry Borum and then also James Daniels. James Daniels got a really nice deal at guard that's going to come in and really shake that up a bit. They also brought in KJ Britt from the Buccaneers as a linebacker, and they strengthened their linebacker core a bit. But ultimately, with everything that we're seeing here with the Dolphins, is it's going to, again, be very similar, same as Alexander Matheson over Mostert is probably an arrow down. He's a player that's probably worth a late flyer on injuries to get a huge amount of work if something happens, but he's not a player that I'm looking to kind of recruit too highly on fantasy teams or put a lot of capital into. They also signed Farrah Brown. He's not going to do much as a tight end. So really kind of the same things as we kind of know. The Patriots moving on to Josh Dobbs comes in as the backup quarterback here to Drake May. Doesn't affect anything for fantasy. They have brought in a couple of wide receivers, which is Matt Collins, who, again, I think there's some value into what he does, but is he a strong fantasy asset going forward? No. So not a guy you need to worry about too much. But then last night they struck the deal with Stephon Diggs. 3-year deal, $69 million. Half of that, I think, is probably guaranteed. We're waiting on the full details of what that looks like, though. I don't imagine it'll be a 3-year deal. I imagine it'll be a 2-year deal, heavily front-weighted. Diggs obviously adds a bit of credibility to a roster that really struggled to move the football last year from a fantasy perspective. What does Diggs have left in the tank? That's the big question. But I like a quarterback that is a pure alpha attached to a rising quarterback with great passing ability in Drake May. He'll be a year better in this league. He'll be a year more experienced in this league. And I think with the work that he'll do with Stephon Diggs, I don't hate it. Is Stephon Diggs a wide receiver 1 in terms of fantasy football next year? No. Is he a contender to be a wide receiver 2? Possibly. And if you can get him for wide receiver 3 terms, I think he's worth that sort of reach. I do think people will overpay for Stephon Diggs on name recognition, especially in more of those sort of casual leagues. So people are going to be out on him because of his age and a couple of years down production. I actually think he's coming to the Patriots with a point to prove against the Bills. I don't think he wanted to leave there. I think he will come in and be splashy. I think he'll make plays. I think he'll have some wide receiver 1 weeks potentially, and he could be a target that's force-fed as he's really like head and shoulders above everybody on that roster. So he's an interesting one to watch. What does this mean for the Patriots going into the draft? I think they will draft another wide receiver, and I think they will also look at running back as well. But I don't think they're doing that in their first 2 rounds. I think they're going to try and strengthen other pieces of this roster. So it's interesting, but also I do think that for a fantasy perspective, Stephon Diggs is interesting. The rest of it isn't really. We look at the New York Jets there next. Justin Fields is the big one here, signing a 2-year, $40 million deal, $30 million fully guaranteed. So look, he's going to be the starter day one. I can't see them drafting a quarterback in the first round of the NFL draft. Now they've signed Fields. Now listen, this is the New York Jets and anything is possible, but I don't overly see it. I don't think that's going to happen. So I think as a result of that, I think you're looking at Fields. Now, obviously, Aaron Rodgers is gone or about to go. Depends on the technical timeline of what is officially he's been released and not. I think officially he's still on the roster and it's a post-June 1st, whatever. Obviously, Devontae Adams is gone and has signed for another team. So we're now at this point where we know it's Fields and it's Garrett Wilson. And they did pick up Tyler Johnson. I don't know if he's a fantasy relevant player. He's probably one to keep an eye on. But with Fields throwing the football, it kind of feels like, please excuse me. It does feel like actually they can only support one target in the Justin Fields offense. I'm pretty strong on that, given his low completion rates, which did improve last year at Pittsburgh when he got the job, but his lack of passing yards, it's very difficult to see more than one wide receiver. I think you're looking at Fields, you're looking at Wilson. I actually don't love Garrett Wilson, but the fact that there's not a lot of competition, if they draft a rookie wide receiver, then I really hate that for him. So I guess we'll see what happens there. And I think the Jets are one of those teams that like anything can happen. Like they drafted Michael Carton and they drafted Breece Hall. Now, obviously that worked out quite well, but they're a team that really if they fall in love with players and they really do fall in love with them, and then they go and invest in that area. So for me, I could see them going with a running back on late day 2 to sort of supplement that room, although they did re-sign Kenny Owangwu, but he's more of a kick returner, to be honest, than a running back. I do think they need to do a bit more on the O-line. They invested a lot on the D-line, which is good. They had some exits in there, and they shored up their linebacker room, which is good. And they brought in Brandon Stevens, which is a big move at corner. But yeah, I do think that they're trying to be a team that will try and score 25 points in the hope that the defense keeps it level. So I'm not too excited for what the Jets do in the draft, but we know that quarterback is sort of off the board for them. Moving to the AFC North, AFC North, and we'll start with the Ravens. They didn't do too much here. What they did do that's pretty outstanding here is they've added DeAndre Hopkins to their wide receiver room. Now, I think it's a nice cachet. I think he's a good sort of value pick here. 1 year, $5 million up to $6 million. We saw the Chiefs last year. He's not fantasy relevant anymore. He's not someone you need to worry about for fantasy, but that's a great sort of wide receiver 3 option that you've got there on that team to go with what they're doing. I don't think that changes too much. I think if it kills anyone, it kills Rashard Bateman. But I think Zay Flowers is going to be pretty fine and protected in that role. There might be a small dip. I don't imagine there will be. I think it's actually Rashard Bateman and that sort of nice little flex appeal that you got from him certain weeks. I think it kind of murks that water, and I think Hopkins and Rashard Bateman kind of muddy that together. Cooper Rush signed a nice little backup option there. It means that, and actually I like this because it does mean that if something was to happen to Lamar Jackson, he sort of misses always a game or two every year. You've got a nice sort of competent QB coming in to throw the football that's not going to kill, say Flowers too much in those little bye weeks, also those down weeks. So that works nicely. The rest of this offense is pretty set. They're not going to go QB. They're not going to go wide receiver. They've got Derrick Henry. Do they find the next running back in this draft? It's a loaded running back draft. So really, they could really get the next guy in, and they could use him as a bit of a tandem to come in and get a bit of work. That could happen, and that might be something I'd be looking for in this draft. But I don't think it's going to take away from Henry too much or be a diminishing return on Henry. But I think that's really all we're going to look for fantasy with the Falcons. Moving on to the Bengals, and the Bengals brought in some RGP Ryan on a small deal, and he's come in to supplement what they're doing in the running game. There, I don't imagine he's going to get a huge array of touches. P. Ryan, it's a nice cheap deal. I think it's a nice little depth piece, but I don't imagine he's threatening for touches or fantasy relevant at all. The big news really comes on the re-signing of wide receivers Jamar Chase and T. Higgins, and also Mike Gesicki. So they've pretty much solidified their room. What we saw last year is what we're going to get. It's pretty much going to be rolling over same again with that team, and I don't imagine them doing anything too substantial in this draft. They could look at running back again. That could be an area that they might. But given the fact that they, have spent a lot of money on Higgins and Chase, I would like to see him attack the O-line in this class and really try and get some pieces to help out Burrow and Chase, really in particular, especially Burrow, to try and get him some protection to make these throws. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, we know what we're getting with the Bengals, and there's not much change there. Moving on to the Cleveland Browns. So this is probably a team that has the most uncertainty here in terms of what we're going to get as a team. So really, in terms of the quarterbacks on this roster, we've got Deshaun Watson, who's injured, and then we also have the trade that happened with Kenny Pickett coming in for Dorian Thompson Robinson, so DTR. And so what that kind of means is Kenny Pickett at this point, I would say, is QB1. And I think that just means that we've got some figuring out to do on what happens with this roster. Is it going to be Kenny Pickett to start the season? I don't think so. I think there's a turn to be had here, and I think that means that there's going to be additional competition coming in. I could see someone like Joe Flacco, who's played for the team before, and I could see that really sort of happening for the team. But I also think, I also think that when it comes to the draft, I don't think they're going to take one at 2. Famous last words. It just doesn't seem to be what the Browns do. Knowing if Cam Ward's there, then I think that will happen. But I think we've resigned ourselves to the fact that Cam Ward is going to go first overall, and I think that's kind of what we're expecting. So if that's to happen, which we do expect to happen, then I don't see them taking a quarterback at 2. In fact, I actually think that they will go with I think they'll go with Carter. I think they'll try and strengthen, or they'll trade back. I think that's kind of where we're where we're looking at them. I think really when we're looking at the rest of the team here, there's not really many question marks. I think at running back they're going to draft one. I don't think they're going to sit here and just keep what they've got here. I think they're going to definitely draft a running back for sure. Jerome Ford is, I think, the only running back on this roster, so I think they're definitely going to draft one. Wide receiver is interesting because you've got Judy, you've got Tillman. Are they going to take another wide receiver? That could happen. So yeah, I think it's interesting. I actually think the Browns are going to do quite a lot in this draft to pick up players. So they're on the lookout for quarterback. They're on the lookout for running back. They're on the lookout for wide receiver. So I actually think this Browns roster doesn't look anywhere near what we think it will be on opening day. And I think as a result, we're going to see some things really shake up for them and change quite significantly. So that's a big one. And then another team that's very much in flux at this point is the Pittsburgh Steelers. So the Pittsburgh Steelers are in an interesting position where they have, Mason Rudolph and Skylar Thompson under center. Mason Rudolph signed a 2-year deal to come back to Pittsburgh, where he's been previously. So that's an interesting one. And that means for me, all the talk is they're going to sign Aaron Rodgers. It's not happened yet, which makes me think, why is that not happened yet? There's something interesting going on there. Maybe there's some doubts. Are they in play for a quarterback in the draft? They're at 18, so Jackson Dart is in play here. That could definitely happen, and there's a fit there. But if they sign Aaron Rodgers, that absolutely won't happen, although there's a chance it could. So quarterback very much up in the air. I don't see them going into the season with Mason Rudolph as the starter, so that something will shift, and I imagine it will be the Aaron Rodgers piece that we would expect to move here. Running back, they've made their choice. They've moved on from Najee Harris. So Jalen Warren's in there. They're backing him up with Kenneth Gainwell, who signed a really cheap deal. I think Gainwell gets touches in this team. Absolutely. I think he's someone to keep an eye on. Jalen Warren's an interesting player that hasn't really earned that one role, despite the fact that he has the talent to. And I kind of liken it to Alexander Mattison behind Dalvin Cook, of a player that clearly showed talent but never really seemed to usurp the top of the board. And now he's there. I actually think Gainwell can come in and earn touches. So I think it's going to be really interesting to watch that dynamic as we get into training camp and preseason. One I would be watching for sure. Wouldn't shock me if the Pittsburgh Steelers draft a running back. This is a loaded class, I keep saying. So that's one I'd be keeping an eye on. One position I'm fairly confident they're not going to touch unless they go in the later rounds is wide receiver. They picked up a lot of wide receivers. So first of all, the big one, they got DK Metcalf in a trade, and then they signed him. Don't forget they've got George Pickens, they've got Calvin Austin, but then they've also signed Scotty Miller, Ben Skowronek, and they've got Roman Wilson. So they are stacked at wide receiver. Like, they don't need anyone else. Scotty Miller's a speedster, good for those deep ball trick plays. DK Metcalf, big body outside. George Pickens, great underneath. Calvin Austin, bit of a burner. They've got nice variety in that wide receiver room. It would shock me if they drafted one above the 5th round, but they might find a guy and really like him, and that's where they might look at. You've got Murf, and then they picked up Donald Parham at tight end, so that works out really nicely. So question marks in this roster will really be sitting at quarterback and running back as we look at what they try and do in the draft. Next one here on the roster is the Houston Texans, as we move into the AFC South. Now, there's not too many question marks here in terms of what they're going to be doing in terms of for fantasy football. We know it's going to be CJ Stroud at quarterback. They've got Davis Mills as their backup, so they could draft another quarterback here to add some competition. I don't think they're going to. Wide receivers look pretty set. Christian Kirk, who they bought in a trade for practically nothing, 2026 7th round pick for the cash. So Christian Kirk comes in. They've got Tank Dell. They've got Nico Collins. They've got one of the best rooms in the league right now. And then you add Justin Watson, who they signed from Kansas City. Got John Mechie. They've got plenty of depth. I think Braxton Berrios signed a deal as well. So they're pretty deep at wide receiver. Tight end, Dalton Schultz, he's going to be fine with Brevin Jordan. So they're sorted at tight end. if I had to look at fantasy football and is there a play here for a position, I'd look at running back again. They got Joe Mixon, which is great. And they brought back Daro Ogunbowale. He's not really going to be a guy that if Joe Mixon goes down, they're going to be able to rely on too much. And they do have Damian Pierce, JJ Taylor, but I don't think for them that kind of makes a lot of sense. So for me, I'm looking at that and thinking like running back could be an area they attack here. But again, it's, Kirk in for Diggs, who didn't really do much. Tank Dell might not make the start of the season. That's going to be one to watch. I think they're pretty stacked at where they are. We know this is a good offense. The big thing is they obviously need to do some work on this offensive line, get rid of their all-pro offensive linemen, and then picking up a load of offensive linemen. Trent Brown, Cam Robinson, Ed Ingram came in the trade, and Laken Tomlinson. They're basically bringing a whole new O-line. This could mean it's a bit rocky for the Texans out of the gate as they try and gel. It's never good to change that many O-linemen in one move, but there you are. There'll be another team when we talk about that we'll go into that. Next up, let's talk about the Colts. Daniel Jones signed for them, and now we have an official. It's probably the first roster we're looking at where you'd say there's a real quarterback competition coming in here. Now, I would expect Anthony Richardson to hold off Daniel Jones, but Daniel Jones is coming in with a lot of money on his name, and he's going to have an opportunity to earn this money. I do think he's going to get a straight shot at it. Obviously, it's a bit harder as the outgoing or as not the incumbent, but I do think he's going to have a chance at this job, and I think it is a fair competition to have Anthony Richardson go up against Daniel Jones. So yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting one to see. Running back here, they signed Khalil Herbert. I think that's an interesting move. I do think that if something was to happen to Jonathan Taylor like it has done in the past, they're a little light. This is another example of a team that could really boost at running back, and one I could really see that happening quite significantly. Wide receivers, they've got Pierce, Pittman, Downs. They've got A.D. Mitchell on the roster. Ashton Dulin re-signed as well. So I imagine they're going to roll with what they've got at wide receiver. Tight ends isn't relevant. They don't really target their tight ends. It's not one I'm really interested in them looking at. They strengthened up the back end with Charvarius Ward, with Cameron Byron. They've really gone hard at sorting out their secondary. And bringing in some big pieces there. So we know there's a quarterback competition there. So we know the wide receivers are good. I'd like to see some running back cover come in to really help solidify Jonathan Taylor. And I think that's an area that could be looked at in the draft. But again, I don't think they're going to draft highly. I think it's a deep class. I'd expect maybe late day 2 that they will dip into the draft and pick up a running back there. Next up is the Jacksonville Jaguars, who have been very busy in free agency, picking up a lot of players. First of all, Nick Mullins to bring in a nice, competent backup quarterback. I like this move. I've always had a little thing for Nick Mullins. I think he's a pretty decent player. Obviously, Christian Kirk went out in the trade. They've replaced him with De'Ami Brown, paid him a decent amount of money, which he's not shown enough in this league. All this tells you is this confidence on Brian Thomas Jr., which is incredible. Gabe Davis is on the roster as well. Parker Washington did well. I would look at this and think this is a prime opportunity for the Jags to go and get a wide receiver, probably second round to maybe third round. I think they're definitely going to do that in the draft, so I imagine that will be something that they will target. Running back is also going to be interesting. You've got ETN and Bigsby, but I think that they could probably look to strengthen, given the situation with Travis Etienne coming off a down year, getting towards the end of his contract. Maybe they look at the next running back, and again, this is a deep class. They could really look at going wide receiver and running back quite early in this draft. It wouldn't shock me if one of those goes round 1, round 2. I would be surprised if they took the wide receiver round 1. I don't think the talent's there, but if it falls to them, then maybe. But yeah, I imagine they'll go quite offensively heavy. They brought in some new. Guards and tackles to come in and really do a job and strengthen up the offensive line, which was a big falling point for them last year. And for me, the other issue they have is at tight end. They brought in Hunter Long, they brought Johnny Munt, who's effectively blocking tight end. Brenton Strange is the main tight end here. Evan Ingram did leave. Are they going to go for a tight end in this draft? Again, possibly. They might look to re-strengthen They've had some successes in the draft recently with Brian Thomas Jr. And I think, with the running backs that they have drafted, they've done reasonably well. I think they're going to trust their talent in the draft, and I think they're going to trust their eyes and pick players up rather than pay these expensive free agents that they have been over the years, which isn't a bad thing to do. So I like this for the Jacksonville Jaguars, but I actually think they're probably one of those teams that are going to have the most change when we get through the draft. I think there's a few players that they could take that could be relevant for fantasy football. We just need to find out who they are. So keep an eye on them. Definitely a team interesting to watch. Next, we got the Tennessee Titans. It's all set and done that it looks like Cam Ward is going to be the number one pick, and he will go to the Tennessee Titans. I imagine that to get done. Running back Tony Pollard and Tajay Spears will continue to be the tandem. Could they go into the draft and take one? Yeah. Do I think they will? Probably not. I think they'll be happy with those two for another year. They could go into the wide receiver, or they could go into wide receivers into the draft. They have got Calvin Ridley as sort of their stud. Van Jefferson has come in, but not paid a lot of money. He sort of comes in immediately as a starting slot. There isn't a lot of competition there. Traylon Burks is still on that roster. He's a bit of a flop. There really isn't a lot of pass targets in this wide receiver room, and there's not a lot of depth. So look, for me, I think it's really important that they go and attack this position in the draft, and they should get away with one or two positions and try and get some weapons for Cam Ward, because I think he's going to struggle just getting the ball to Calvin Ridley and then Tony Pollard. So they're going to need to do a lot of work here on this side of the ball. They've still got chicken concrete. They don't really use tight ends as much as they should. Maybe they go for another tight end in the draft and they find something that's fit. I imagine there'll be some movement here. They have invested a lot in their offensive line. They've brought in 3 offensive linemen. They've done quite a bit on the defense as well. So I think there's quite a bit of work that they are doing. They've been really busy in free agency. This team will be a bit more competitive, I think, in 2025. So we'll see what happens there. Right, we move on to the AFC West, one of the more interesting teams to talk about, a surprising playoff team last year, which was the Denver Broncos. Denver brought in Jarrett Stidham again, so they brought him back to be the backup. They brought in Evan Ingram. That's the big splash on offense. Immediately solves the need. We know that Sean Payton loves tight ends. We know what he likes to do with them and scheme them up, and I think they've got a great one there. So I think that's a really big move there. I do think they're light at running back with Jaleel McLaughlin and Audric Estime. I expect this would be a position they target in this draft. I've said that about 6 or 7 teams now. But, call out the big card. I think they're going to need to. There was nothing in free agency. It's a deep class, so I imagine that they will sign a running back in this draft. I don't think they're going to do too much at wide receiver. They invested in Troy Franklin and Marvin Mims Jr. and Deshaun Vile. They brought in Trent Sherfield as a bit of a utility player. I don't think he does too much. They strengthened the defense here. I think Denver are going to be good to go next year. I would like them to bring in a solid running back just to really strengthen that part of the game a little bit more. But I think for fantasy football, that's kind of all we can expect as they're going to roll pretty much same as last year, other than maybe that running back position. Moving on to Kansas City next. And again, Kansas City signed a lot of players, mostly backups. Gardner Minshew, Bailey Zappi have come in, or I think Bailey Zappi re-signed. So, they've got all the depth at quarterback here. They have brought back Kareem Hunt. They've signed Elijah Mitchell, which I think is a sneakily good signing for not a lot of money, which I think is really solid. So that running back room is stacked with Pacheco, with Hunt, with Mitchell. I think they're sorted there. There's not much you're going to do there. Wide receiver, I still think it's interesting what's going to happen with Xavier Worthy. Is that going to all work out? Looks like it should be fine. I don't think they're pressing any charges. I think he should be okay with that. Got Worthy, Hollywood Brown, Rashee Rice. Rashee Rice kind of will be back and reinstated. And Sky Moore still on the roster. Juju still there. I think they probably need one more. They might target that in the draft. They're fine at tight end with what they've got. So if I'm looking at the draft forward, I think maybe looking at wide receiver, I wouldn't get too excited with whoever they draft. So I think for me, it's pretty much what we saw of the Chiefs in 2024 is pretty much what we'll see again in 2025. Maybe some backup touches for for Mitchell if he gets a chance. One team that will be quite a bit different in 2025 is the Las Vegas Raiders. They have gone with Pete Carroll as head coach, which means they're going to get a bit older, a bit wiser. They've acquired Geno Smith, which I really like this trade, and they acquired Raheem Mostert, and they didn't pay him a lot of money either, which I think is even better. So for me, I think that's a good combination. They're going to run the ball better in 2025. They've got a better quarterback in 2025 throwing the football. Obviously, Brock Bowers there, they're set. I actually think they need to do a lot at wide receiver here. Jacoby Myers really is the only wide receiver. I'm surprised they didn't attack the position in free agency. Maybe they did and they couldn't get anybody in. But I expect them to go heavy on wide receiver. I can see them taking 2, maybe 3 wide receivers in this draft, depending on the amount of picks they've got left. Obviously, they did trade the 3rd round picks, and maybe that shortens their likelihood to do that. But they've signed Max Crosby back. This is a team that's very talent poor. I don't think they're competing in 2025, but I think Pete Carroll will bring a bit of stability to this team. I think they'll get better in 2025, but I still think they're a long way off. I guess really we're just hopeful they're going to sign a big wide receiver, and that could be really relevant for fantasy points. But I quite like picking up Raheem Mostert. I think you're going to get him a good price in fantasy drafts. He might be worth a flyer because I think that with Pete Carroll, they will try and run this football, be a bit more old school, traditional. Moving on to the Chargers, last team in the AFC, and then I'm going to blitz through the NFC in under 15 minutes. Let's start with what they've done. Najee Harris is kind of the big piece here. So he comes in to be the starting running back. I still think they need another piece. I think they could go for that in the draft. They brought in Tyler Conklin as tight end, which I really like. I think there's a skill set that wasn't utilized at the Jets anywhere near enough. I really like this signing. I think that's really, really good for them. And they brought in Mike Williams. Mike Williams comes back after a year away. He's back on the team. He will join Lab McConkey, Quinton Johnston. They also brought in Jalen Rager again, so he's back. So I think they've got nice pieces at wide receiver. I don't think they're going to do much here. They could pick up an extra piece. I really think this team is just about running the football. I think they'll look for another complementary running back. Although Haskins is on the roster, Vidal, they might roll with that. I do think they're probably candidates to draft one as well. But they've signed a lot of players in defense to do more of what Harbaugh wants them to do. But really, from a fantasy perspective, you might get a running back there, but I don't think much more is going to change. We move on to the NFC. We start with America's team, the Dallas Cowboys. And look, there's not much really to write home about here. Miles Sanders has signed on a 1-year deal, as has Javonte Williams. Both of these are going to compete for the starting job. I think Javonte Williams will win that deal outright. He's got more ability. He's a better running back. Am I inspired by those choices? No. Do I think either of them are going to be great picks for fantasy? No, not really. I think both of them are going to be overpriced. I think Javonte Williams especially is going to be overpriced. I might take the flyer on Sanders because I think you could get him for next to nothing, and he might be the flyer to usurp. Given Williams' struggles and injury record, he might be a really interesting late-round flyer. But we'll see what happens with the pricing. I think they've got to do a lot. I think they need to do a lot on wide receivers here. I just don't think Jonathan Mingo is the guy that's going to get it done. They've signed Paris Campbell, the speedster, but he's always injured. They got CeeDee Lamb, they got Jalen Tolbert. I think they need to do more, support Dak with more weapons. I just don't think he's got enough to get, it's just going to be the CeeDee Lamb and Dak show, and then what happens? Jake Ferguson's going to get involved as well. But this team needs to do quite a bit in the draft for me. I think they need to do more wide receiver and more at running back. We've got the New York Giants, who have signed not 1, but 2 starting quarterbacks. So it'll be interesting to see what happens here. It looked like Jameis Winston was going to get the starting gig, but then they also went up and followed that up with Russell Wilson. So I think you're seeing Russell Wilson as the starter, Jameis Winston as the backup. It also means they're not going to take a QB at 3. I imagine they'll probably go Travis Hunter. I don't know if that's the right move for the Giants. I actually think they probably need to do something a bit better than that. But hey, we will see what happens. Running back, they're running with Tyrone Tracy, who did a good job last year. Devin Singletary. If there's the opportunity to add something else there, I think they should. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to. I would like to see another wide receiver come in to support Neighbors. But they signed Darius Slayton to a lot of money, 3-year, $36 million. They also signed Zach Pascal, little Jordan Humphrey. and Smith Barset, which I just think I'm not too inspired about any of that. If I'm honest, I think they're all depth pieces. Jalen Hyatt's on the roster. I'd like to see him do more. I don't know. I just think there isn't. It just feels like it's going to be a lot of Russell Wilson to the elite neighbors. They still need a tight end. Theo Johnson didn't break out anywhere near enough as he should have done. He did sign Chris Manhertz, which is one of the best names in football. Listen, the Giants need to do a lot. I don't think they've done anywhere near enough. I think they're an interesting team to watch in the draft. Eagles lost a lot of players in free agency. But look, they've paid Saquon Barkley a lot of money. They acquired DTR to be the backup. So that's going to help them. I actually think Tanner McKee will be the backup. I think DTR is going to be the 3. I think McKee has been there. He's the incumbent. I think he's probably going to keep that job. They bring in AJ Dillon to back up the running backs and kind of replace Gainwell, which kind of makes sense, but not fantasy relevant. Do I think that the Eagles are going to do anything that's going to impact fantasy football in the draft? No. Yeah, Dallas Goddard's going to be there. They got AJ Brown, Jahad Dotson, Devonta Smith. I don't think they're doing anything on the roster that's going to sort of jump out the page and add anything to fantasy football in 2025. So one to kind of not really kind of keep an eye on, but I don't think they're going to do much here. And then we go on to the Washington Commanders. Now they have been really busy. They acquired Deebo Samuel in a trade for next to nothing. They signed Michael Gallup. They re-signed Noah Brown. They re-signed KJ Osborne. They re-signed John Bates. They re-signed Zach Ertz. So it's interesting. You've now got, they brought in Laramie Tunsil from the Texans to really strengthen up their O-line to support Jaden Daniels. You've got Brian Robinson Jr., you've got Austin Eckler. This team isn't changing too much. They could go for another wide receiver maybe, but they signed quite a lot, which makes you think that they're not going to do that in the draft. They like what they've picked up for utility pieces. They got their main weapons, Terry McLaurin and Deebo Samuel. I think Deebo Samuel adds a lot to this team. I think this team's going to be very vertical, very fun to watch in 2025, but I don't think the NFL draft is going to bring anything outside of what we already know for them in 2025. Moving on to Chicago, and they basically replaced their entire O-line. Jonah Jackson's come in. Joe Thuney's come in. He's one of the best tackles or best guards in football. So I like what they've done here to strengthen Caleb Williams. Here, running back is, Swift, Roschon Johnson. They brought in Travis Homer as a bit of extra hit. They brought in Devin Duvernay at wide receiver. It's just a bit of a depth piece at slot, but not really going to do much. Same with Zacchaeus. Those two are going to fight it out for the starting slot spot, but I don't think you're going to get much here. I think you're looking at DJ Moore and Roman Dunze being the main guys. Maybe they go slot receiver in the draft. There's a couple of good ones. They could definitely do that for sure. I don't think I'd want to be going into the season with Amade Zacchaeus as my starting slot receiver, but there you go. He did well in the playoffs, though, for Washington. So maybe if they want to copy that playbook, that could work reasonably well. Darren Smythe has come in at tight end behind Cole Kmet. They still need to do something at tight end for me, so there's a bit more work to be done there. So maybe they're candidates to look at for tight end, and then also maybe a slot receiver in the draft. Continuing on with the AFC North, we are here with the Detroit Lions. They re-signed Tim Patrick, which was successful for them. They really like him there. They brought in Kenny Yeboah to be tight end. But actually, I don't think this team's going to do much on offense other than maybe some depth pieces. Maybe you could look at wide receiver. At the moment, it's a bit of a toss-up between Khalif Raymond, Tim Patrick. Who's going to get that? I think they like Patrick. I think that's going to stay where it is. They're not doing anything at running back with Gibbs and Montgomery. Goff is going to be the starting quarterback. They go backup quarterback, given Hendon Hooker's the 2, Carl Allen's the 3 they just signed. Maybe. I don't know. I don't think they're going to do much here from a fantasy football perspective that's going to strengthen what we already know about them. I think they've had a good free agency, sort of strengthening other pieces of their team that really let them down. They signed or re-signed 4 corners, brought in some linebackers too, just to add a bit of defensive depth because they've been really struggling there this season with all those injuries. Arguably one of the quietest teams in free agency has been the Green Bay Packers. They've actually only signed 5 players, and one of them or 2 of them have re-signed, which is Isaiah McDuffie and Brandon McManus. So 2 players re-signing with the team. So really, Nate Hobbs is probably the big expenditure here, and Aaron Banks. So Aaron Banks is a guard, Nate Hobbs at cornerback. The only offensive addition they made is McCole Harbin, which I think he comes in more as a special teams specialist. Now, obviously, Jordan Love under center. They've got the tight ends and Tucker Kraft and Luke Musgrave. They've got running backs and Josh Jacobs, Marshawn Lloyd, Emmanuel Wilson. So they're pretty stacked there. Wide receivers stacked in Reed, Watson, Dubs. They all kind of take away from each other. They've got Dontavian Wicks. Now you've got McCole Harbin. I don't think they're going to do a lot. Again, I think this is a team that's going to strengthen in other areas in the NFL draft. I don't see them doing a lot to really affect fantasy teams in 2025. Last one in the North is Minnesota. And again, Minnesota sort of re-signed Aaron Jones to a deal. They acquired Jordan Mason, which I love in a trade. I think they're really set now with their running back room, which is what they needed. Wide receiver room set. Quarterback, they're going JJ McCarthy. They're screaming it from the rooftops. That's who they want to start. And that's what they've done. Brett Ripien is the backup. I think they probably need to get someone else in there. If nobody signs Joe Flacco, then I absolutely believe that the Vikings should. They signed Rondale Moore, who I actually really like. I think he's a heavily underrated player. He could get some snaps this year, but I don't think anything fantasy football. But I think the big thing here is JJ McCarthy. He's been surrounded with weapons and talent to succeed. Would like them to do a little bit more on the O-line. Would like them to do a little bit more just to help him with some coverage. But be interesting to see how the JJ McCarthy era kicks off in 2025. Moving to the South, Atlanta have been very, very, very busy in free agency, but effectively for what it means for fantasy football, not a lot. They haven't really changed anything on what we're expecting to see. It's going to be Penix, it's going to be Kyle Pitts, it's going to be Mooney and Drake London, and it's going to be Bijan Robinson, Tyler Algier. That's what we're going to see. That's not going to change. The draft isn't going to change any of that. They've really been trying to solidify their trenches quite nicely. Have been really busy. They have brought in Jamal Agnew and Kadero Hodge. I think they'll get some snaps, but I don't think they're going to threaten box scores too often. One team that I'd argue needs to do a lot more and probably hasn't is Carolina. They re-signed Andy Dalton, and maybe they go back into this Bryce Young versus Andy Dalton competition again. I think Bryce Young showed some improvement at the end of last season. Did they do enough? I don't know. They did bring in Rico Dowdle to add competition to Chuba Hubbard, but they paid Chuba Hubbard a lot of money, so I don't think he's coming in as competition. I think he's coming in to try and get some, but I don't think he's going to get a majority of the role there. David Moore re-signed with the team, but this team needs to do more at the wide receiver position. And feeling he's getting on a bit. Xavier Legette and Jalen Coker, it's just not enough. They need to do a lot more, and they need to get more vertical down the field. They really need a deep ball, deep threat guy with a bit of pace. So I imagine that's what they're going to target in the draft. I imagine they're going to do more at that position, and we will hope to see it, definitely. Moving on to the New Orleans Saints. They re-signed Brandon Cooks for the second time. He's obviously been there before, previously in his history. And they needed some wide receiver help because they didn't have much there when Shaheed and Olave were down. They pretty much thrown to nobodies. They brought back Dante Pettis. They brought back Juwan Johnson. They're going with Derek Carr and Alvin Kamara for another year. So I think offensively, this team doesn't change too much other than Cooks coming in. So I do think they need a tight end. But we're going to get straight on to the last team in the South, which is the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And again, it's going to be a lot of same old, same old. They re-signed Kyle Trask to be their backup quarterback. They re-signed Chris Godwin, which is amazing for the team, who turned down more money elsewhere. They re-signed Sterling Shepard, which is a bit of a strange one. They've made some changes to the offensive line, but not too much, and brought in a pass rusher. And tried to strengthen the linebacker core. I do think the Buccaneers are not going to do too much offensively on the ball in the draft. You might see, with everything they've got with wide receiver, they're not going to do anything there. Could go tight end. I don't necessarily think that will be the case but you never know with the Buccaneers. But they've got a deep running back room. They've got a deep wide receiver room. They've got an okay tight end room. They've got their quarterback. From a fantasy football perspective, I expect the Buccaneers to line up pretty much as they did last year, obviously changing offensive coordinator yet again. So there will be some changes in personnel and changes in the way. We'll break that down as we go through the summer. But just to let you know that actually in the draft, I don't expect anything significantly to change from the Buccaneers from a personnel perspective. I expect them to fix some of the holes they have on their roster at linebacker, in the back end, in the secondary as well. That's kind of where I'd expect to focus in the draft. Moving on to the NFC West final division, crack through these. We'll start with the we're going to start with the Arizona Cardinals. And the Arizona Cardinals are sort of an interesting team to look at here, where I still think there's a lot of holes on this roster. It's a team that they were competitive last year. They did quite a lot. They've obviously got the wide receiver situation with Marvin Harrison Jr., so they've got their main guy. They've still got James Conner and Trey Benson. I do think they probably need to think about the future at the running back position. This could be a draft, as I keep saying over and over again, for them to tackle. They did bring Jacoby Brissett in to back up Kyler Murray, which I think is a really smart move to get a veteran in here. They have added Zay Jones to this team, and I do think he gives them a bit of extra edge on the outside there. And I think he will definitely bring some extra ability here. But I do think this wide receiver room is a little bit light, and I would like them to address it in the draft. I also think they still need to do a bit of work on this offensive line to add some protection to Kyler and open up some lanes for James Conner. But on the whole, I think this team is improving, but it needs to improve in other areas. But wide receivers, one I'd be watching for in the NFL draft. But so far, it's been a pretty decent free agency for them. We move on to the Rams. They restructured Matt Stafford's contract. So ultimately, he got to speak to other teams. Then he decided that he's going to stay with a revised deal, which is, it's good news. But it also says that the future is out there. Jimmy Garoppolo's coming back to back him up, but I actually think this team will draft a quarterback. I'd love them to draft Kyle McCord, but I actually think they could take any quarterback on early day two, and this is where there'll be a very, very good, interesting landing spot here for a quarterback, and the quarterback that goes here will absolutely be one to watch because there is a pathway to him getting that role reasonably quickly. Obviously, they got Kyron Williams coming off a really good year. Ronnie Rivers has come in to sort of back him up. I don't think that's going to be quite enough. Blake Corum really didn't do a lot. And again, he's similar in type to Kyron Williams. Could they go back into the draft again and take a running back? Yeah, I think that could definitely happen. Absolutely. And then Cooper Kupp has left this team. We're going to talk about him in a minute. But he is being replaced by Devontae Adams, which again just adds some immediate boost. And they're bringing back Tutu Atwell. So you got Nakua, Adams, Atwell. It's going to be interesting how that works for fantasy. I think Nakua and Adams can absolutely eat in this team. Tutu's going to have some great best ball appeal here for some spike weeks. For sure, Jordan Whittington as well is another one that sort of in my sort of eyes, I'd be looking at him from a best ball perspective, not so much in a shallow roster league at all. I do think this team could do something at running back. I do think they could do something at quarterback in the draft. I wouldn't, maybe even wide receiver. There's a sneaky case that they bring someone else in, but for me, I think there's stronger needs on this roster than those, but I do think they do need to add a couple of pieces here. Absolutely. And so one to watch in the draft. San Francisco next. San Francisco brought in Mac Jones to back up Brock Purdy. We're still waiting on him to sign his deal. I think that will be at some point in the near future. For me, they've got weaker. They've let two great guys out in Jordan Mason and Elijah Mitchell. So this running back room has got a little bit weaker with Christian McCaffrey coming back from injury. You got Isaac Guerrero, who did very well. But then, I definitely think you're in this position. Patrick Taylor's coming back, but I expect him to go in the draft and draft one here to sit behind McCaffrey, to do some work with McCaffrey for sure. I do think there's something here that all signs point to a running back getting drafted by this team. Not in day one. I would expect this to probably be a day two pickup somewhere in rounds 2 or 3. this team also is in desperate need of wide receiver help. Yes, they drafted Ricky Pearsall and they've got Brandon Ayuk and they have got Juwan Jennings and they did pick up DeMarcus Robinson, but I just think they're a little light. They've let Debo go. I don't think you're letting Debo go to then not bring somebody in. So I do think that they are going to take a wide receiver here. So I expect day 2. I'd expect them to address the running back and wide receiver positions on this team. They have brought in Luke Farrell to come in and they've paid him a good amount of money. So I don't expect tight end to be an issue here. Do you think they've got to do a bit in the trenches here? They've tried to do a little bit here, but they really addressed the back end of this team as safety cornerback here in free agency. But look, you've got the backup quarterback sorted in Mac Jones, who's competent. They've re-signed Kyle Juszczyk. Doesn't mean much for fantasy, but listen, they got the fullback sorted. I expect you probably want to see a running back and a wide receiver come into this team in the draft and just give it a bit of extra bump. So that's what I'd be expecting to do. And then one team that's been busy but actually doesn't have a ton of acquisitions is the Seattle Seahawks. Let's talk first off that they now have got rid of Geno Smith. They've gone with Sam Darnold on the back of what he did last year, which I think is it's a good move for them. I think that gives them a lot of confidence going forward in their guy and what they want to deliver on. So, I think it made sense to move on from Geno and bring in Sam Darnold and shoot for the upside. I think makes complete sense. They're in a competitive division. So, sometimes you've got to see. And whether Darnold gets there is a different question, but they've given him the opportunity and they can get out of that deal relatively easily. Most of that cap sits in year 1 where they got the cap money, which is good for them. The running back situation, Kenneth Walker, Zach Charbonnet sorted. They're not going to do much with there. Could they draft one late? Yeah, they could, but I don't think it's going to affect fantasy for this year. The wide receiver room is drastically different. DK Metcalf has gone. They have replaced him with Cooper Kupp, and also they have brought in, and this is a sneaky under the radar signing of Marcus Valdes-Scantling. So what they have here is you have 3 guys that absolutely perfectly complement each other. I think, Jackson Smith and Jigba will probably, move away from that sort of slot role. He'll probably play a little bit more wide. You've got Marcus Valdes-Scantling as that really deep role, and then you've got Cooper Kupp out there doing the more slot role. So I think you're going to see Jackson Smith and Jigba play more to his strengths. I think you're going to see him play more in that intermediate range. So you've got your burner in Marcus Valdes-Scantling to get down the field. You've got the guy in the intermediate range, and then you've got Cooper Kupp in that short to intermediate range and Pepper with targets. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how Smith and Jigba sort of adjusts to his sort of role in this team. What's the volume going to look like on Cooper Kupp? What's the injury history? How's he looking? That's what we've got to kind of look at. And in the tight end position, Noah Fant is a former first-round pick. He just hasn't lived up to those levels. And I do think that he's going to need to do something here. AJ Barner's on the roster, and then they did sign Eric Saubert. They could draft a tight end. It's a decent tight end class. I could see them, but I don't think it's a priority for this team. I think they're going to want to go in different directions here in terms of supporting Sam Darnold with a stronger offensive line. They brought in Josh Jones, but he's more of a rotational piece. I think they're going to need to do something there. They have brought in DeMarcus Lawrence for the edge. They have brought Jaron Reed back. They've re-signed Ernest Jones as well. Ernest Jones, and they've got some nice pieces going here. This is a team that it's sort of in contention for a late playoff spot in the wild card, but they will need to get some pieces in to really help them in the draft. From a fantasy perspective, I don't see anybody coming in the draft that from what I'm looking at that I think is going to add any additional value to what's already on the roster. So, I think when we're looking at this from a dynasty perspective, a lot of these teams, from what I've gone through team by team, you're going to already know where we are. Quite a lot of these teams, you can feel pretty confident about how it's going to shape up. And the teams that got really key areas, I think we've identified them in this pot. So I think you've got a bit of everything here. We've gone through free agency as it stands right now. There'll be a couple more moves. I think Joe Flacco is going to get a team. Aaron Rodgers is the big piece out there. There are some other big players to drop, and there could be some, there might be some changes to what we've got here that is effectively still out there. If I look at who's still out there in terms of positions, quarterbacks, there's not much left. You would say that Aaron Rodgers is the only one out there. Joe Flacco as a backup. If we're looking at the running back position. You've still got J.K. Dobbins, who could get a team. Nick Chubb is still out there. But the fact that the market's gone very quiet on him says that there probably isn't anything for him. But the wide receiver room, you've still got Amari Cooper out there. He's going to add something to a team that needs it. Elijah Moore is still young, and he gets open. I think you're going to get someone there. He can get somewhere in this league for sure. Keenan Allen, someone's going to take a flyer on the experience. So there's still some players out there that you can absolutely load up on for fantasy, that these dominoes could still fall before the draft and could make some changes. I know the same goes with, if you're looking at other positions, you're looking at offensive tackle. I can't believe Jedrick Wills is still out there. So I think he's going to get a chance somewhere else in this league. He's a former top 10 NFL pick. Brandon Scherff is still out there. I imagine that he's going to get a job out there. I mean, he signed a mega deal with Jacksonville. It never really happened for him, but I'd expect him to end up somewhere as well. So there's still a few good players out there in free agency. So Darius Smith is still out there. There are some good players. Calais Campbell, I mean, admittedly, he is nearly 39. But I think he still wants to go for one more year. So that will be interesting. Kazir White's out there still, so you could see him go somewhere as well. There is still some depth. There's still some players you can get out there. Santi Samuel Jr. is still out there. Stephon Gilmore, Mike Hilton, these are still players that are out there on the defensive side of the ball, as is Justin Simmons as well. So really good players still out there. These teams can still fill their rosters between now and the draft, and I imagine some of these players will get signed, and there could be some updates to rosters before the draft. But now we kind of know what the landscape is and what this means for the NFL draft. What the NFL is telling you is they're out on these quarterbacks, that there isn't anyone in this quarterback class other than Cam Ward they see as a starter right away. So the rest of this from a landscape, and we'll get into this later on in the week, is that they don't see these guys as starters. Now, this could change, but the way that these teams are signing quarterbacks and the way that they're bringing them in, there aren't many teams that need a quarterback now. A lot of them did it last year. So there is not a lot of need. The biggest need in here is running back, and that suits the class. It's a very deep running back class. A lot of teams with running back need. A lot of teams will bring in running backs in this draft. I can see a huge number. Are we going to get loads at the top of the board? I don't know. I could see it. I could see anywhere between 0 and 3 running backs go in the first round, and that would shock people when I say 0. But running backs don't have that same value and cachet as other positions, and especially with the pay, you have to give a top pick. But I do think that you'll see 2 drafted in the first round, maybe 3. But there is that chance that 0 could happen just due to the stigma position. Wide receivers, there's not really too many top guys in this draft compared to the last couple of years. A lot of good, solid players, but how many of them are really affecting fantasy football in 2025? Not a great ton. Tight ends elite at the top. It's good middling, but it's not the deepest class. It's a good class, but it's not the deepest. So that's kind of where we're at. Heading into the draft, and we know what everybody's looking for. It's really interesting now as we're starting to ramp up and see everything. Lots of people obsessing with rookies and mock drafts and all of these sorts of things. The one thing I'm going to tell you, there's 2 things I'm going to tell you on mock drafts, right? Number one, that a lot of the mock drafts out there where they're mocking 3 or 4 quarterbacks, the NFL is telling you that that's just not going to happen. So I don't see it personally. The second thing is that, I'm seeing people get absolutely killed for some of their rankings. And, even me last season, and I'm not a big Chris Sims guy, right? And Chris Sims last year had Marvin Harrison as his wide receiver 3 in the draft, and everyone had him at 1. He was the consensus 1. He went 1. Everyone was like, Marvin Harrison's the GOAT. He's going. They'd already anointed him in the Hall of Fame. Chris Sims had Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas Jr. above of Marvin Harrison, and I look at that now and think that's not a hot take. Like, if you look at it 12 months on, you go, there is an absolute rationale to that. Now, longevity of career, that can change. My point is, don't go too wild on these mock drafts and think that is the way of the world. That is a person's opinion, which they're entitled to. Same way I'm entitled to mine. Same way you're entitled to yours. Don't read too much stock into them. Just accept it for what it is. And then, my opinion is there's not going to be that many quarterbacks going round one. So I think these mocks are out of whack. And I think you're going to see more defensive players and less wide receivers going than perhaps what is being mocked, because I think people have got this recency bias and it's just not the case. So yeah. Anyway, that's going to do it. Thank you so much for tuning in. Pleasure as always. And until next time, Rush Nation, don't forget, as always, keep rushing.